We all live in a watershed. At Pennsylvania American Water, we are deeply protective of our watersheds because millions of people depend on us every day for safe, clean drinking water. We take care of water from the source to the tap and back to the source again, taking pride in returning it cleaner than we found it. Join us in keeping our watersheds clean, so together we can keep life flowing for generations to come.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second webinar in a series celebrating the Delaware River as our 2020 River of the Year. I'm Jen Adkins, Director of Clean Water Supply for American Rivers here in the Mid-Atlantic region, and a longtime fan of the Delaware River. I'm pleased to be your moderator for today, and I want to start by thanking the Stroud Water Research Center for hosting this webinar series with us, as well as our 4 panelists who you will get to meet in a minute. For nearly 50 years, the mission of American Rivers has been to protect wild rivers, restore damaged rivers, and conserve clean water for people and nature. Today, this mission is more vital than ever, and we envision a future of clean water and healthy rivers for everyone, everywhere. To achieve this mission, we focus on 3 things: healthy ecosystems and the fish and wildlife that need cool, free-flowing streams; thriving communities, both urban and rural, that depend on rivers for healthy environment and economy; and clean water that we all need to survive, 2/3 of which comes from rivers in our country. Natural infrastructure, the focus of today's conversation, is important for all 3 of these. Natural infrastructure uses natural features like plants, trees, and soils, and nature-based solutions that use or mimic these features and their functions to provide clean water and other benefits, sometimes referred to as ecosystem services. One type of natural infrastructure that you may have heard of is green infrastructure or green stormwater infrastructure, or sometimes called just GSI. But natural infrastructure can take many different forms and provide many different services, as we'll hear from our panelists today. We're devoting this webinar to natural infrastructure because there have been such innovative solutions using it in the Delaware River watershed, which led to our designating the river as River of the Year. From cities to suburbs to farms, innovative water management using natural infrastructure is an important tool for restoring the Delaware River watershed to health. The format of today's webinar is a panel presentation, and we have a great group of experts on our panel, each with a unique expertise and perspective on natural infrastructure. Over the next half hour, these panelists will respond to a series of questions from me, much like a conversation, and then we'll open it up to a few questions from the audience. So first, I want to point out 2 important Zoom functions that we'd like you to use. One I can see that some of you are already using, and that's the chat function, which we'd like to see just a little bit about where you're joining us from, if you're willing and comfortable doing that. Please use the chat function for that. With so many people in the audience, we can't get introductions from everyone, and this will tell us just a little bit about who's out there. Next, I'd like to point out the Q&A function, which is much like the chat function, and to ask you to please use the Q&A anytime during the program to pose questions to our panelists. When we get to the audience Q&A segment of our program, I'll select a few questions from the Q&A for panelists to answer. Okay, so let's meet our panelists. I'm going to ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves. Matt, why don't you get started with that?
Sure. My name is Matt Earhart. I work with the Watershed Restoration Program at Stroud Water Research Center, and a significant amount of my work is on agricultural land and working with farmers to improve watershed protection and conservation.
Great. Leah?
Hi, I'm Leah Mastropolo from American Rivers. I work with local governments and other nonprofit organizations across the Delaware Basin and the Mid-Atlantic region to promote the policies and practices at the local and state level that advance the use of green infrastructure.
Great. Michelle?
Hi, I'm Michelle Adams. I'm a civil engineer and hydrologist from Meliora Design. I've had the privilege of working with both Stroud and American rivers, and most of my work is focused on sustainability, green infrastructure. I worked on my first porous parking lot back in 1983.
And Peter?
Hi, I'm Peter Howell at the Open Space Institute, Executive Vice President. We're a land conservation organization, work across the eastern United States, including in the Delaware, to protect forests, to ensure water quality and climate resilience.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's dive into some questions then. In the last webinar of this series, we heard from a policy expert and a scientist on how the health of the Delaware River has rebounded over the last 50 years. At what point did natural or green infrastructure begin to play an important role in the Delaware River's comeback? And how has it evolved since then? Leah, why don't you get us started on this?
Yeah, just a second. Can everyone hear me all right? It sounds like, I don't know if I was having mic issues. Is this better? Okay.
It's better,
cool.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. So in the past 50 years, so after the Clean Water Act really put a stop to the biggest sources of toxic pollution in the 70s, there was this big step forward in terms of cleanup in rivers, but then the progress kind of stalled. And that's because all the pollution that comes off of developed areas when it rains, which is stormwater, it wasn't easy to regulate. So in the early 2000s, EPA started requiring local governments and developers to start to take more responsibility for the pollution that comes with land development. So none of those regulations really required green infrastructure, but they put a new focus on water quality, and that started to lay the groundwork for this idea of designing landscapes that could mimic natural systems. So in the Delaware Basin, the city of Philadelphia's Green City Clean Waters Plan was really a landmark. It was the first plan of its kind to require green infrastructure as a primary means of meeting the city's Clean Water Act permit requirements. And so that plan was launched in 2008, and now 12 years later, a lot of other cities in the basin and really nationwide have followed suit and really made green infrastructure a much more common practice. And I think that's because it works. It works at improving water quality. And if it's done right, it can really add to the quality and character of public spaces in urban areas. So it's been slower going with green infrastructure for smaller suburban towns, I think, to transition to using green infrastructure, partly because their water issues typically aren't as bad at the local level, even if collectively they are really damaging. In 2014, in the Delaware Basin, natural infrastructure got a big kickstart when the William Penn Foundation launched the Delaware River Watershed Initiative, which is a big collaboration and funding program that's driven a ton of really good work in this area. So we're starting to see more green infrastructure in the suburbs as well as in the cities as people start to understand that the problems of climate change and flooding and water pollution are all really interconnected. So I think a lot of people are starting to expand their definition of what infrastructure can and should be, and recognizing that for what it costs, it's really not enough for it to just do one thing anymore.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Peter, what's your perspective on this? Oh, you're on mute.
I think Leah set the stage beautifully. The regulatory framework that she described so well, both at a national level and in Philadelphia, as I said, set the stage for a lot of terrific experimentation. What I'd add to that is that there's been an explosion of interest in green infrastructure because we have more scientific knowledge, and really importantly, we have economic thinking, modeling, and research that is beginning to sketch out and prove the economic sense of protecting natural infrastructure. So, for example, you know, we know in the world I work in, protecting forests, 53% of the fresh water supply of this country is basically contained in forests, typically in headwaters, streams, and in rivers upstream. And there's just a lot more knowledge we have now about the importance of protecting that asset to ensure water quality downstream. We have science that's beginning to show that information, and we have new models. There's a lot of interest in pay for performance models. The DC water green bond that you may have heard about, which the investment community created a new bond to help finance the expansion and utilization of green infrastructure. That was the regulatory world framework created that, but you needed markets, you needed investors to actually make good on implementing that. And that notion of how do we finance green infrastructure because of the payoff it has long-term, and that it actually can be cheaper than gray infrastructure is I think something that's been catalytic in the expansion of the interest broadly in green infrastructure, from protecting forest land to using green infrastructure to reduce stormwater runoff. So those are some of the key factors that I think are hastening the acceleration of this new approach.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the topic of that payoff concept is going to come up again, I think, in our webinar today. So thank you both for that. My next question is about, you know, diving a little bit deeper on what green infrastructure is, and from the perspective of your particular expertise and the people you work with, what would you say is a good example of natural infrastructure and conservation practice? And Michelle, I'm curious to hear what you think about this.
Sorry about that. Well, in terms of natural infrastructure and conservation, the thing that I see as very powerful is for local municipalities and jurisdictions to have ordinances or regulations that, when development does occur, requires a developer or property owner to identify and map their riparian buffers, their intact forest stands, their mature trees, their important agricultural soils, with the idea of not stopping development, but designing in a way that protects and enhances those important resources that Peter was speaking of, that provide so many ecosystem services to improve water quality. So things like ordinances that encourage natural shorelines instead of seawalls, that require setbacks from wetlands, those kinds of natural infrastructure practices go a long way from my perspective as a civil engineer whenever anything is being built, and even in urban situations where you want to maybe identify your important trees that are providing urban heat island cooling and absorbing stormwater. So knowing what those resources are is a really important practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Matt, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to think about our agricultural conservation practices sort of as green infrastructure. And we certainly have, you know, ag has analogs to green and gray infrastructure. We may not typically think about them that way. I might be helpful to think about them in two categories. There's practices like riparian forest buffers, which, in addition to providing a filter function, you know, are essential to the ecosystem health of our stream systems. But they may be a harder sell with landowners because they're not viewed as part of the production system. They may be viewed as taking some land out of production or more of a public good. And I guess in contrast, there are practices we would consider soil health practices like no-till agriculture and cover cropping, which are generally viewed as part of the agricultural production system by the farm community, and they have extremely important and have a huge impact from an environmental standpoint. They may be one of our biggest options, excuse me, for storing carbon. When you think about the impact of hundreds of thousands or millions of acres of sort of production ag ground improving infiltration, maybe tripling to quadrupling the infiltration rate, that can have a tremendous impact on watershed hydrology and resiliency. So I think the ag practices really are an opportunity we haven't thought of in the green infrastructure space enough.
Yeah, and I think even sometimes just by talking about natural infrastructure as green infrastructure, it's easy to forget that we're also talking about soil and the functions that soil plays. Is probably one of our most important types of natural infrastructure, especially if you're thinking about farming and agriculture practices. And I think that's something that farmers are pretty attuned to. So again, based on your experience and work, going back to something that Peter brought up, who pays for natural infrastructure and what's the payoff or the value for them? And we know that cleaning up polluted rivers and restoring degraded watersheds can be expensive, but can natural and green infrastructure help accomplish more protection for fewer dollars, and how? Leah, what do you think about this?
So cities and towns are facing this huge need for infrastructure upgrades because of these converging stressors of flooding from climate change and water pollution, and also their existing infrastructure systems are just aging. So the thing about green infrastructure is that it can do a lot of what traditional water infrastructure does for the same or lower costs, but with the added benefit of being something that's visible and improves community spaces rather than just being hidden underground like pipes. And so there's a number of federal and state and private funding programs that can be used to leverage municipal funds for green infrastructure. So if communities are kind of wise, they can align those green projects to meet other needs that they've identified. So for example, they might use trees and rain gardens to help revitalize a downtown streetscape that needed it anyway. So this is where partnerships with community groups can be really important in identifying and serving local needs, and also in aligning different sources of funding. So an interesting question for the future that Peter started to talk about is this idea of how can more private investment be integrated into this work? And so maybe that's through social impact investing. That can even be done through regulations, I think, to some extent. So to give a regulatory example, in the Delaware Basin, the state of New Jersey just revised their rules for new development to require that green infrastructure be a part of new construction projects. So that work now is going to be integrated into the developer's plans and budgets. And often, because this is part of existing work, this can be done with no increase or just a small increase in the cost to the private sector. And so that's a really great way to get this work done through that standard development process. Another example of a more market-based approach would be the green bond program that Peter mentioned, which I understand is gaining a lot of traction with investors, and it has been for a while. So cities can issue these bonds to fund their green infrastructure projects. I think DC Water issued the first one in 2014. And so that's another really cool opportunity that's growing. And I guess in all of these cases, I think that integrating the private sector into this work really gives us the opportunity to make it more mainstream and also to make it more available to everyone. And so that in turn also helps to lower the costs.
So speaking of the private sector, Matt, what has your experience with this been in agriculture and with farmers?
So agriculture has definitely benefited from a broad array of funding programs over the years, many of which come at the federal level through the Farm Bill. There's certainly state programs and a fair amount of private philanthropy going into this kind of work on farms. Some practices, like the forest buffers I mentioned earlier, my senses are definitely going to continue to take external resources to keep implementing them on farms, given the way they're viewed in the ag community. Some practices, like no-till and cover crops, are widely accepted and often paid for completely by the farmers, or perhaps with some some small amount of funding to facilitate the transition and the, the changes in management that are necessary. In some cases, it's not money, but it's technical assistance that's really critical to folks adopting new practices. I think there's certainly potential for the carbon markets to come into play from an agricultural perspective, as well as opportunities like the Water Fund in the Brandywine right now, which is working to sort of promote offset and trading between MS4 communities and agricultural best management practices. I think there's a really interesting societal question hidden in here, though, that is, sort of how do we view the use of sort of scarce public grants and resources to help meet regulatory obligations, whether that's stormwater and MS4 based or agricultural requirements. There's not enough grant money to go around and fill the coffers for everyone. So what's our expectation of sort of equitable distribution of those resources in a regulatory context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, questions of equity, I think, are definitely on a lot of people's minds these days when it comes to our spending. But you also raise a good point about green infrastructure, in that, our focus today is heavily on water quality, because that's one of the things that we're really focused on, our organizations. But the services that can be provided from green infrastructure range to a whole bunch of other things. And Leah, you mentioned this too, from carbon to community benefits, including cooling and, better streetscapes, and even impacts on property values. So they're pretty broad ranging. So in thinking about, the benefits of green infrastructure, what do you see as some of the top barriers or the enablers that maybe aren't there yet for really using natural infrastructure? And this could be from the implementation standpoint, from a policy standpoint, or another perspective. But Michelle, what has your experience been on this?
Yes. So in terms of barriers, so I work as an engineer and I work on development projects. And what I find is that engineering calculations don't give adequate credit or representation to a natural infrastructure and the benefits it provides. And the way we do our engineering calculations undervalues those resources in a way that it's difficult for design engineers to do their calculations and get their permits and incorporate natural infrastructure or green stormwater infrastructure in a meaningful way. So there's some examples of different things that have been done, and a very good one comes out of the city of Philadelphia, where they are requiring all development to manage their stormwater, and there's no grandfathering. So for instance, if you have a parking lot and you turn it into a high rise, you don't get credit for it already being a parking lot. You have to manage that stormwater too. You have to hold the first 1.5 inches. But then they add incentives. So if you do things, for instance, like if you plant trees near your parking lots or you protect existing trees, that counts as stormwater credit. Green roofs, porous paving. So we need to find ways to put those incentives for green infrastructure and natural systems into our engineering calculations to see it more widely applied.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Peter, what kinds of barriers or enablers have you seen?
Well, to really simplify it, and I want to build off of Michelle's really grounded thoughts there, is it's about knowledge and money and constituency. And my general thinking when I think about green infrastructure is that we need better knowledge that can prove the benefits, in this case, to green infrastructure or protecting forests. How do those things actually contribute to measurable increases or maintenance of water quality? The science is evolving, as I said. It's robust, but it's still not completely there yet. Toward that end, I want to mention that my organization, with support with William Penn, is conducting a large-scale multi-year assessment of the contribution of land conservation, forest conservation to water quality. This is involving a mix of modeling and monitoring. I'm going to put right into the chat now some documents of some early findings, some comparisons of what various other jurisdictions are doing, how they're approaching land conservation and water quality. There are knowledge gaps, that just reflect a little bit of the bias of gray infrastructure. I think that's sort of changing. We see it reflected in various municipalities and in water authorities. We also see federal funding programs like the Regional Conservation Partnership Program of the Department of Agriculture that's making a much bigger push on water quality and supporting the protection of forests. I think, regulatory agencies still are a big issue. They face constraints. They have ratepayers. Some of this natural infrastructure forest stuff is squishier. It's harder to quantify, and so they face challenges in incorporating and approving those uses. But again, the markets may leapfrog some of these regulators, and we've heard reference to carbon credits and the expansion of financing vehicles through green bonds. It just may be that the finance people are showing the way in this sense. I also just want to point out that not to diminish the regulators, the Chesapeake is actually looking at, and have been for some time, how to incorporate forest conservation into compliance with the TMDL, the total maximum discharge limits rule. And the idea that you might prevent things from getting worse if you keep things protected to begin with so that you don't have to clean it up and restore it afterwards. So I think there are a set of barriers, again, around information, around getting the economics better, and then importantly about developing a constituency. As people see more rain gardens, as they see their forests protected, I think we have the power to create a new constituency. And I applaud American Rivers for their work across the country in educating and engaging people around rivers and water. And that's a really essential third leg of the tripod. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And this kind of wraps up our prepared discussion segment of the program today. I've just been scrolling through the chat to see, some of the people that we have in the audience, and it looks like we have people from all over joining us today. Definitely quite a few from Pennsylvania, some Penn State folks, some Westchester folks, but also Tucson, Arizona. I see Seattle, Washington, Ithaca, New York, Middlebury, Vermont, Boulder, Colorado, Athens, Georgia. So we have quite a variety of participants today when it comes to the geography, just in case our panelists haven't seen that. I am going to now, let's see what kinds of questions we have from the audience in our Q&A. And I may, while I'm looking at these, throw one out there that I'm curious about myself to get you started. And that is, the reason that we chose to talk about natural infrastructure is because we're seeing a lot of innovation around that. So I'm curious to our panelists, what are the most innovative ideas you've seen when it comes to natural infrastructure and conservation practice, and what makes them innovative? And I'll throw that out to whichever of you would like to take that on. Or maybe we could hear from all of you. Looks like Matt and Michelle both have have unmuted themselves. So Matt, why don't you get us started, and then Michelle, you can follow up.
Well, I guess one of the things that may not be sort of what we typically think of as innovation, but these soil health related agricultural practices, they grew from the bottom up rather than, from the university or, from the science side down. So farmers began adopting these practices because they saw opportunities from a production standpoint, and they have really developed the methodologies because these are management practices. You don't just do something and leave it alone and it works for you. So they've figured out how to fit these into production schemes, and we're still trying to catch up with the conservation values piece of that. I think to sort of stumble into the incredible increases in infiltration and the carbon storage capacity are things that the conservation and science folks sort of discovered after the practitioners were doing the practice. And that's, that's just the reverse order of how this often works. So it's been really interesting to work with the ag sector on bringing those pieces together.
Michelle, what are you thinking about innovation?
Well, building off of what Matt said with soils, I agree that soils is where it is. And we often joke that if engineers and contractors were farmers, we might have fewer stormwater problems because they understand soils. And I'll give you an example. There's a project down in the University of Pennsylvania where they built a new plaza over top of what used to be tennis courts, and below that, rubble from old row houses. And they put in engineered soils to hold and absorb the stormwater, and it's planted in lawn because it's a high use area. So they hold graduation events out on the lawn, but it's a huge sponge that absorbs water, doesn't infiltrate it, evaporates it back up. They monitored it for 3 years. They find that it can hold over 3 times more water than the engineering calculations showed. That the trees they're monitoring are tremendous water pumps is to put water back up into the atmosphere. So I think building off of what Matt said, there's a lot to be learned and implemented in soils and vegetation and how that incorporates into our practices.
Mm-hmm.
So I see a couple of things. Matt referenced the Water Fund, which is a nascent effort in the Brandywine to basically steer money from municipalities seeking to comply with MS4 upstream to around a series of restoration practices that will ensure water quality and help those communities comply. And that's really cool. There are all kinds of water funds birthing around the country. Some out west focused on fire management to ensure water quality in Denver, for example. We're working on something in Maine, a voluntary water fund to get major water users to contribute. I'm going to include that in the chat in a second. So I think water funds are one thing. I love the notion of river-friendly communities, which I think American Rivers and other folks have spotlighted, which are sort of informal certification schemes. So there are varying levels of specificity around certification or water funds that I think are pretty cool and are on the forefront. I'm going to just shoot them into the chat if that's okay.
That sounds great. So I don't know, Leah, if you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, I can add kind of a different perspective on that, just in terms of some of our partnerships work that American Rivers has been working on. So up until the pandemic started, we'd been working with business and community groups in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, on this little demonstration and funding concept that we called Gateway Gardens. So this was trying to get at the problem of how to align all the different community needs around greening and water quality into a way that you could actually get projects funded on the ground. And so the concept behind this project was that most communities have what we're calling gateways to the community, which are usually along major roads. Usually there's some kind of green space there, like a traffic triangle or a median. And these places can offer really good opportunities for green infrastructure because there's a lot of runoff that's coming off of the road. And it's also usually an area that the local government wants to make more visible and more appealing for people that are coming into the town. And so they're also really good places to put signs, which we thought, what if we offered local businesses the opportunity to sponsor some of the gardens in this area in exchange for some kind of recognition on the signage, like a welcome sign. So we put together this screening concept to find these community gateways that kind of fit that criteria, and then a funding plan for how we could leverage partnerships that would benefit the town in terms of what they needed to do for their stormwater permit. It could potentially benefit the state DOT if they also had permit obligations for stormwater. And then it could provide this amenity for the community. And so we did a survey of local businesses to try to answer the question of would they be willing to contribute to something like this in exchange for recognition. the results were actually really promising. So the local businesses that we surveyed, that this was pre-pandemic, but they said they were very interested in giving back to their community, and they were interested in environmental projects, and they were also interested in being recognized publicly for their commitment to this kind of work. And so it seemed like a really promising pathway that, you know, we could model in Lancaster and then potentially use in other places in Pennsylvania and even across the country, because there's so many different communities that have all these same characteristics. Unfortunately, COVID cut this work short because local businesses are obviously, you know, just looking at staying afloat right now, and not a great time for them to invest in water infrastructure or community development or anything else, but it's something that we've got on the back burner as just another path that we can follow to start to get at this funding challenge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so look for more on that coming soon, hopefully, but a lot of different ways to try and get private investment into green infrastructure. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A. One, I think, is a fairly quick follow-up question for Michelle, which is, what was the location of the amended soils for the athletic field that you mentioned?
It's the Shoemaker Green Plaza down at the University of Pennsylvania, right next to Franklin Field. They built a big plaza, and that has amended soils that are literally built on top of the old tennis courts, which are lined. So it's kind of like, if you're familiar with green roofs, it's a green roof at ground. And that's the kind of thing we can do in a lot of urban environments. So that's the location.
Mm-hmm. We also have another question, which I think it's sort of a basic one, but it's an important one, I think, in terms of what we really want to make sure we relay today. And we've talked about this as a group, the panelists, but someone mentions we've used the term green infrastructure in the presentation, but do we think the general public truly knows what that term means? So I don't know if any of our panelists want to reflect on this. I certainly could, but I think folks would rather hear from you if there are thoughts on this. How to make this public friendly.
Sure, I do. I work in forest conservation, and we use the word landscape scale conservation a lot. And what the public tells us is they think that they think of landscaping companies, you know, so we don't use that word anymore. A green infrastructure is a wonky word. I mean, infrastructure is a cool word, kind of people get that, roads and stuff, but green infrastructure, if we dewonked it a little bit, we might just say it's about nature, and it's trees, and it's gardens, and it's forests, and it's using nature to do many of the things that we know it can do just as efficiently or sometimes more efficiently than we can do. So if we just talk English sometimes, but it's nice to have a shorthand phrase, that's why we use it. But good point.
If I could just add, the term ecosystem services is something people understand. What are the benefits provided by natural systems? People understand that.
Anyone else?
I try to even just use the term greening rather than green infrastructure when working with like a lay audience. But I think what's more challenging is then the background on what greening does for watersheds, and even like what a watershed is. And so I think there's a lot of work that the environmental community has to do in terms of like how we communicate what we're talking about and why, and avoid some of the technical background. It can be really challenging, I think, but super important.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in New York City, every middle schooler learns about the watershed. It's actually in the curriculum because we are one of the few places in the world that still uses nature to primarily filter our water in the form of upstream of the city through reservoirs. So actually kids have to learn about it. And I think if we all did, we might get it. But Leah makes a great point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I love telling my friends who live in New York City that their water comes from the Delaware because a lot of them don't know that.
Some of it, not all of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true. It sounds better if you just say it comes from the Delaware. So we do have a comment in the chat that I think our panelists might want to respond to. And it is that Matt makes an interesting point about using private resources to meet regulatory obligations. And that we need to keep in mind that many communities have experienced years of environmental burdens from poor water quality, and some of those burdens are realized downstream from multiple sources. Equity considerations should include who in our society has benefited from financial support from the federal and state government and who has not. And while it's true that many farmers do not have regulatory obligations under the Clean Water Act, that's the result of a political solution and does not reflect water quality impact. So that was the comment, but I think, you know, the question is that I see underlying this is, what do we think and what are we doing about this equity question that is on so many people's minds? And how does that come into play when we think about green infrastructure or natural infrastructure? Anyone want to?
I think it's a really important point, and the complexity of not just sort of how we got to where we are, but the details of resources that have gone different directions and why is, you know, sort of a morass of policy decisions over decades or longer. And I, you know, I think it's going to be a public policy question for a while to think about how we tease that all apart. And Ellen commented further down about the potential for some of our solutions, like the water fund, to lead to outcomes we hadn't necessarily thought about in terms of additional burden for urbanized areas. And she's absolutely right. You know, the Clean Water Act has some very specific outcomes in mind. They're not about how much you invest or what it models to look like. It's about when you get things cleaned up, and how we measure that. And so, you know, I think we're going to be wrestling with some of this for a while as we move forward.
Michelle, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to chime in on this?
Sure, just that there's a number of papers that have been put out and research done looking at green stormwater infrastructure in urban communities and the value that provides to communities in terms of safer neighborhoods, better air quality, human health. So I think that's an important equity component.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I was thinking similarly. One of the reasons I know at American Rivers, and we have been thinking and working on issues of equity, one of the reasons that we have prioritized green and natural infrastructure so much, part of that is because we see that as potentially a more equitable solution than some of the others. But I certainly think anytime we're talking about any kind of trading, we need to think about where are we trading to and from, because there is opportunity for that to maybe do different things than what we thought it might do. Peter, did you want to weigh on this?
I think there's a massive equity issue here that goes to the upstream downstream issue. So, you know, a lot of downstream communities in urban areas have been dumped on, and they've been dumped on by pollutants and polluters in their neighborhoods, but they've also been dumped on and affected by the practices upstream of them in communities that are far different and sometimes are more affluent. And so I think the issue of who finances the work of ensuring water quality downstream, it cannot fall entirely on those people downstream who had no role often in the problems that were created. So how do we think about that and the responsibility of upstream communities, polluters? There's a reckoning here that has not yet been dealt with. There's some fascinating work that I can share by a group called Fathom and another entity on related to this on rivers, looking at the effects of flooding, which happens a lot around rivers, and the disproportionate effect it has on under-resourced communities. And we're just beginning to understand how great that burden is, and we've not really figured out whose responsibility it is, and it's a shared one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great comment and remarks to wrap up on, because I see that we are now at 1:15, and it's time for us to wrap up. It went by really quickly. But once again, in wrapping up, I just want to thank all of our panelists, as well as the Stroud Water Research Center for co-hosting with us, and everyone in the audience for spending time with us today. I think it's been a great conversation. I hope you all enjoyed it, talking about natural infrastructure, and that you will join us for the next webinar in the series on the Delaware River as River of the Year, which I think will be coming up in January. In the meantime, just say take care, be well, and enjoy your local rivers. And Scott, did you want to add anything to wrap us up?
Sure, Jen. I'll mention that the next webinar in our 4-part series is January 13th next year, and the title is The Journey from River to Faucet, about our drinking water here in the Delaware. So please put that on your calendar and watch our website and American Rivers website for the registration info. And thank all of you who joined us today. All right.
Thank you all.
January. Thank you.